I can still hear Chelsea's laughter echoing through the living room that autumn afternoon. Cold and cruel, it cut through me like a knife as she stood there pointing her manicured finger in my direction. "You're being selfish, Eugene. We sold that land for you. You wouldn't even have had that property if not for Lucas doing all the paperwork. You owe us." The words hung in the air of my modest Maplewood home, the home where I'd lived for 40 years, where I'd raised my son, where I'd said goodbye to my Margaret. Now it felt like foreign territory, invaded by people who wore familiar faces but carried strangers' hearts. I stood there, stunned into silence, aware of every pair of eyes in the room watching me, my son Lucas avoiding my gaze, my grandchildren shifting uncomfortably, even Chelsea's sister smirking from the corner. They all thought the same thing, that I was just a feeble old man past his prime, a burden to be managed. "Fine," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected. I reached for the manila folder I'd placed on the coffee table earlier. "Since you both feel so entitled, why don't we take a look at this?" With deliberate slowness, my hands shaking not from age but from barely contained anger, I opened the envelope and removed the original land deed, yellowed with time but perfectly intact. "I never signed the transfer," I said, looking directly at my son. "The land was never legally sold. And if you look closely, you'll see that the signature on the copy you used, it's forged." The room went silent. Lucas froze mid-breath. Chelsea's smirk vanished instantly. Across the room, my grandson dropped his soda can with a metallic clank. Nobody moved, because in that moment, they all realized the man they thought was weak, old, and irrelevant had just turned the tables completely. But how did we get here? Let me take you back to where it all began. The inheritance came unexpectedly, like most things in life that change your course. Forever. My Uncle Harold had passed away, leaving me 10 acres of farmland on the eastern edge of Maplewood. Not prime real estate by any measure, but good, clean Illinois soil that had been in our family for generations. "What are you going to do with farmland, Dad?" Lucas had asked when I told him about the inheritance. We were sitting at my kitchen table, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. He was 42 then, with salt and pepper hair starting to appear at his temples, looking more like his mother every year. "I don't know yet," I'd answered honestly, "but it feels right to keep it in the family." Lucas nodded, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He'd always been practical to a fault, a trait I'd admired in him until it started bordering on cold. Calculation. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years during which I'd visit the land occasionally, walking its perimeter, watching the seasons change across its emptiness. I'd stand there and imagine Margaret beside me, her hand in mine as we discussed what might grow there. Sometimes I'd bring a folding chair and just sit, watching clouds drift overhead, finding peace in the silence that had become my constant companion since her passing. The first sign of trouble came gradually, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. Lucas and Chelsea began visiting more frequently. Not just the obligatory Sunday dinners, but random weeknight pop-ins always bearing gifts. Chelsea's homemade lasagna, a new sweater, offers to fix the leaky faucet or clean the gutters. "You don't need to. Do all this," I'd tell them, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "Nonsense, Eugene," Chelsea would say, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Your family." Chelsea had always been charming when she wanted something. I'd watched her work her magic on Lucas for 20 years of marriage. The subtle compliments, the strategic touches, the way she'd make him feel like the most important man, in the room right before suggesting they needed a new car or a vacation to Cancun. Now that charm offensive was directed at me, and it made me uneasy. Then came the questions, casually slipped into conversation like poison in tea. "Have you thought more about that land, Dad?" Lucas would ask while helping me with yard work. "The property taxes must be such a burden," Chelsea would mention while serving dessert. "You know, land values are at an all-time high right now," Lucas would note, showing me some article on his phone. Each time I'd give the same answer: "I'm keeping it for now." Each time I'd catch the glance they'd exchange, that look of frustration and recalculation. By the time winter arrived, their visits had decreased. The lasagna stopped appearing in my refrigerator. The offers to help around the house dried up like summer puddles. I told myself I was relieved, but the truth was, the house felt emptier than ever. Spring came, and with it, a certified letter from the county clerk's office. I remember standing at the mailbox, tearing open the envelope with my reading glasses perched on my nose, the birdsong and lawnmowers creating a soundtrack to the moment my world shifted. It was a record of property transfer. My land, Uncle Harold's land, had been sold for $480,000 to one Lucas Wallace, my son. I read the letter 3 times, my hands growing number with each pass. There at the bottom was my signature, or what looked like my signature if you didn't know the particular way I crossed my G's, or the slight upward tilt of my E. I drove to Lucas's house. Immediately the letter crumpled in my fist, my heart hammering against my ribs. Their house sat in one of the newer developments across town, 2 stories of beige siding and black shutters, a perfect match to every other house on the block. Chelsea answered the door in yoga pants and a look of surprise. "Eugene, what a nice surprise. Lucas isn't home from work yet, but what is this?" I thrust the letter toward her, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. Her eyes flickered to the paper, then back to my face. Something shifted in her expression, a tightening around the mouth, a calculation in the eyes. "Why don't you come in?" she said, stepping aside. "I think we should talk about this when Lucas gets home." The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. I sat in their pristine living room, surrounded by catalogues for kitchen renovations and travel brochures for tropical destinations, while Chelsea made small talk and kept refilling my water glass. When Lucas finally walked through the door, his tie loosened and briefcase in hand, I watched his face fall as he registered my presence. "Dad," he said, setting down his things, "Chelsea texted me you were here. What's going on?" I stood up, feeling every one of my 67 years in my joints. "You sold my land without my permission." Lucas loosened his tie further, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was caught in a lie. "It's not what you think, Dad." "Explain it to me then," I said, my voice quiet but firm. What followed was a masterclass in justification and half-truths. They hadn't sold the land, Lucas insisted. They'd just used it as collateral for a loan. The market was perfect, the opportunity too good to pass up. They were going to tell me eventually, once everything was finalized. "The money's still yours, technically," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We just needed it for some investments." "Where is it?" I asked. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. "The money's gone," Chelsea finally said, her voice flat. No pretense of charm now. "We had expenses." "Expenses," I repeated, the word feeling hollow. "What kind of expenses eat up nearly $500,000? Chelsea straightened her spine, suddenly defensive. "My student loans, for one. Do you know how much interest accumulates over 20 years? And the kitchen renovation we've been planning for ages. The contractor was available immediately if we paid up front." Lucas jumped in, his voice placating. "We also helped Chelsea's sister get her business off the ground and took the kids to the Bahamas. They've never been anywhere, Dad. We deserved a break." "You deserved—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The audacity of it struck me dumb. "Look," Chelsea said, her patience clearly wearing thin. "It's not like you were using the land. You're living alone in that big house, driving an old car, wearing the same 3 sweaters. What were you saving it for?" "For my grandchildren," I said quietly. "For family." Lucas had the decency to look ashamed, but Chelsea just laughed. That same cruel laugh I would hear again months later. "Well, we are family, and we used it for family, just not the way you planned." I left their house that night with no answers and no resolution. The money was gone. The land was, according to county records, no longer mine, and I had no idea what to do next. The following week brought another shock. I was watering my front garden when a moving truck pulled up to my curb, followed by Lucas's SUV. Before I could process what was happening, Chelsea was directing movers toward my front door. "What's going on?" I asked, garden hose still in hand. "We're moving in," Chelsea announced cheerfully, as if informing me of dinner plans. "Lucas, tell your father." My son approached, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Dad, we've been thinking. This house is too big for just you. We're cramped in our place with the kids getting older. It makes sense for us to combine households." "No," I said simply. "It doesn't make sense at all." "Dad, this is my home, Lucas. I didn't invite you to move in." Chelsea stepped closer, her voice dropping to ensure the movers wouldn't hear. "Eugene, be reasonable. That land money, you wouldn't have gotten it without Lucas helping with all the paperwork. We're your family. Legally, we're entitled to help you manage your affairs." "I don't need help managing my affairs," I insisted. Your doctor might disagree, she said sweetly. You missed your last appointment, remember? And the neighbors mentioned you sometimes forget to bring in your mail. The threat was veiled but clear. They would question my competence if necessary. By nightfall, they had moved in completely. My quiet, orderly home was suddenly filled with noise, chaos, and the constant presence of people who clearly saw me as an obstacle rather than a person. The final indignity came when Chelsea showed me to the basement. We've set up your bedroom down here, she said, gesturing to a hastily arranged space with my bed and dresser. Lucas and I need the master bedroom, and the kids each need their own rooms. You'll be more comfortable with your own space anyway. I stood in the basement, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the smell of mildew, and felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, but my faith in what family meant. That night, I lay awake listening to the creaking of my house under the weight of unwanted guests, wondering how I had lost control so completely. Above me, I could hear laughter, music, the sounds of people enjoying the home I had built with Margaret, the home where I had planned to live out my days in peace. For weeks, I tried to make the best of it. I tried to be the understanding father, the doting grandfather. But Chelsea's dominance grew more pronounced daily. She rearranged my furniture, gave away Margaret's china — it was just collecting dust, Eugene — and began telling friends and neighbors that I had begged them to move in because I was lonely. The humiliation was complete when I overheard her on the phone with her sister. It's just temporary. Once he's gone, we'll sell this place too. The lot alone is worth a fortune to developers. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the old filing cabinet in the corner of the basement, the one item they hadn't touched because it contained boring old papers. With trembling hands, I began sorting through decades of documentation, tax returns, insurance policies, Margaret's medical records. And there, in a folder marked Family Property, I found it. The original deed to Uncle Harold's land, unsigned, untouched. The signature on the sold copy wasn't mine. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. I felt hope. The original deed sat heavy in my hands, like a forgotten promise suddenly remembered. I stared at the yellowed paper, tracing my fingers over the embossed seal of Maplewood County. This wasn't just a document. It was my lifeline. The next morning, I called Louis Barrett. Louis had been my lawyer for decades, more friend than legal counsel. We'd played basketball together in high school, attended each other's weddings, supported each other through the losses of our wives. If anyone would help me without question, it would be Louis. Jean, it's been too long. His gravelly voice greeted me over the phone. How are you holding up? Not well, Louis, I admitted. I need to see you privately. Something in your voice tells me this isn't a social. Cool, he said. My office, 2 p.m.? I agreed, then spent the next hour figuring out how to leave my own house without arousing suspicion. It had come to this, sneaking around like a teenager with a curfew, in the home I'd owned for 40 years. Chelsea was in the kitchen when I emerged from the basement, directing her latest renovation, a complete overhaul of the cabinets Margaret and I had installed, together in the 90s. I'm going to the senior center, I announced, the deed safely tucked into an inside pocket of my jacket. Chelsea barely looked up. Take your medication before you go, and be back by 5. Lucas's boss is coming for dinner. I nodded, swallowing my resentment. I'll be back. The walk to Louis's office took longer than I remembered. My knees protested with each block, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight I'd been carrying for months. By the time I arrived at the modest brick building where Louis had practiced law for 30 years, I was out of breath, but resolute. Louis ushered me into his office immediately, concern etched across his face. You look like hell, Jean. I feel worse than I look, I said, sinking into the familiar leather chair, across from his desk. For the next hour I laid out the whole story, the inheritance, Lucas and Chelsea's sudden interest, the fraudulent sale, and now, my effective imprisonment in my own home. Louis listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. When I finally produced the original deed, he examined it carefully, comparing it to the copy of the transfer document I'd brought along. This is forgery, plain and simple, he said finally, leaning back in his chair. And not a very good one. Look here. He pointed to the signature on the transfer. The G is all wrong, and the slant is inconsistent with your handwriting. What can we do? I asked, hope and fear battling within me. Louis removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. Legally, we have several options. We can file for an injunction to freeze any further transactions involving the property. We can initiate fraud proceedings against Lucas. I don't want my son to go to jail, I interrupted. Jean, Louis said gently, what Lucas did is a felony. Real estate fraud, elder abuse, possibly even identity theft. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's criminal behavior. I sat with that uncomfortable truth for a moment. Is there another way? Louis thought for a moment. We could approach it civilly first. Document everything. Secure the original deed in my safe and confront them with the evidence. Give them a chance to make restitution before we involve the authorities. That seems fair, I agreed, though the word fair felt hollow in my mouth. What was fair about being betrayed by your own child? There's something else you should know, Louis said, his expression grave. I took the liberty of running a title search on your house while you were telling me your story. There's a lien against it, Jean. They've used it as collateral for another loan. The room seemed to tilt. They've mortgaged my house without my knowledge. I'm afraid so. The paperwork was filed 3 weeks ago. Signature looks like the same forgery technique. I felt sick. Not just my land now, but my home. Margaret's home. The walls that held our memories, the garden where she'd planted roses that still bloomed every spring. They were gambling it all away. How much time do we have? I asked, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. The loan is in default already, Louis said. They missed the first payment. We have maybe 30 days before the bank initiates foreclosure. I stood up, suddenly energized by anger and fear. I need to stop this now. Louis nodded, reaching for his phone. I'll start the paperwork immediately, but Jean, he hesitated. You need to be prepared. This will tear your family apart. I thought about the family dinners where I'd been relegated. To the end of my own table. The way Chelsea spoke over me when neighbors visited. How Lucas couldn't meet my eyes anymore. My family is already torn apart, Louis, I said quietly. I'm just going to make it official. Over the next week, Louis worked tirelessly. He filed emergency injunctions to freeze both properties, contacted the bank to alert them to the fraud, and prepared a civil case against Lucas and Chelsea. I provided statements, handwriting samples, and documentation of how they had manipulated their way into my home. Meanwhile, I maintained the charade at home. I ate meals with them, nodded along to Chelsea's plans for updating more of my house, and pretended not to notice how they whispered when I entered a room. Each night, I retreated to my basement bedroom and added to the journal I'd started keeping, documenting every slight, every unauthorized change, every conversation about what they planned to do with their inheritance once I was gone. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Chelsea had invited half the neighborhood for dinner, another display of her generosity in taking care of poor Eugene. I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes while she directed everyone where to sit. Eugene, you'll be at the small table with the children, she called over her shoulder. We need the main table for the adults. Something in me snapped. This was my home, my dishes, my dining room table, the one where Margaret and I had celebrated 40 Christmases together. No, I said, loud enough that the chatter in the dining room ceased. I'll be sitting at the head of my table in my house. Chelsea turned, her smile frozen but her eyes flashing with anger. Don't be silly, Eugene. You'll be more comfortable with the kids. Lucas, talk to your father. Lucas appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of embarrassment and irritation. Dad, just do as Chelsea says, don't make a scene. A scene, I repeated, my voice rising. In my own home. The home I paid for. The home your mother and I built together. Dad, no, I interrupted. I'm done being pushed aside. This is my house. Those are my things. And that land, I pointed toward the east, where Uncle Harold's acres lay, was never yours to sell. Chelsea's laugh cut through the tension, that cruel, dismissive sound I'd come to dread. You're being selfish, Eugene. We sold that land for a... True, you wouldn't even have had that property if not for Lucas doing all the paperwork. You owe us. The room fell silent. Our guests shifted uncomfortably. Even Lucas looked shocked at her outburst. I stood there, suddenly calm in the eye of the storm. I think, I said quietly, it's time for the truth. I walked slowly to the basement, aware of the confused murmurs from the dining room. When I returned, everyone was seated, neighbors, friends, Chelsea's sister and her husband. Lucas stood by the fireplace, his face ashen. Chelsea remained standing, arms crossed defensively. "I apologize for the interruption," I said, addressing our guests. "But there are some things that need to be cleared up." "Dad," Lucas warned, "this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I countered, placing the manila folder on the coffee table. "Since you've invited all these people into my home to witness my humiliation, they might as well witness the truth as well." I opened the envelope slowly, with deliberate hands that no longer shook. From it, I removed the original land deed, now protected in a clear plastic sleeve, along with Lewis's notarized analysis. "This," I said, holding it up for everyone, "to see, is the original deed to my uncle's land, the land that my son and his wife claim to have sold for my benefit. As you can see, it was never signed, never transferred. The document they used was forged." Chelsea's wineglass shattered on the floor. No one moved to clean it up. "That's ridiculous," she sputtered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Lucas, tell them." Lucas said nothing. The color had drained from his face completely. "There's more," I continued. "They've also taken out a loan against this house, my house, using the same forged signature. That loan is already in default. They've spent over $500,000 of money that was never theirs to spend." One of our neighbors, Helen Morris, who'd known Margaret and me for 30 years, gasped audibly, "Lucas, is this true?" My son's silence was answer enough. "Eugene," Chelsea tried again, her voice switching to the syrupy tone she used when manipulating someone, "you're confused. The medication sometimes—" "I'm not confused," I interrupted firmly, "and I'm not on any medication that affects my memory or judgment. I am, however, working with the county prosecutor's office to determine whether criminal charges will be filed." The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "Criminal charges," Lucas finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, possibly grand larceny," I listed calmly. "Louis Barrett has the complete list. He's been very thorough." Chelsea's composure cracked completely. "You can't do this to us. We're family." "Family doesn't forge signatures, Chelsea. Family doesn't steal homes. Family doesn't relegate each other to basements while planning to sell off their property." My grandson, Tommy, 16 and usually glued to his phone, stood up suddenly. "Is that why you made Grandpa sleep in the basement? So you could take his room?" The look of betrayal on his young face cut through the tension like a knife. Chelsea faltered, reaching for him. "Tommy, you don't understand." "I understand fine," he said, backing away from her. "You lied, you stole from Grandpa." It was that moment, seeing my grandson's disgust, watching the understanding dawn on our guests' faces, that finally broke through Lucas's frozen state. "Dad," he said, stepping forward, "can we talk about this privately? Please." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw, not the confident, successful man he pretended to be, but the frightened boy he'd always been beneath the surface, always trying to measure up, always falling short, always looking for shortcuts. "We're past private conversations, Lucas," I said. "The bank has been informed. The loan is being reversed, the land is still legally mine, and this house is no longer under threat of foreclosure." "What does that mean for us?" he asked, and I could hear the fear in his voice. "It means," I said simply, "that you need to find somewhere else to live." The silence that followed my declaration hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Our guests began to shift uncomfortably, murmuring excuses as they gathered their belongings. Helen Morris squeezed my shoulder as she passed. "Call me tomorrow." "Eugene," she whispered, "whatever you need." Within 10 minutes, the house had emptied of everyone except family. Chelsea had retreated to the kitchen, the sounds of aggressive dishwashing punctuating the silence. Lucas sat on the couch, head in his hands. My grandchildren, Tommy and his younger sister Lily, huddled together at the bottom of the stairs, watching with wide eyes. "How long do we have?" Lucas finally asked, not looking up. "Louis says the bank will need statements from all of us," I replied, my voice steady. "Once that's done, they'll expect the house to be vacated within 30 days. 30 days? Chelsea reappeared in the doorway, dish towel clutched in her white-knuckled hands. "That's impossible. Where are we supposed to go? Our house is rented out." "That's not my concern," I said simply. "Not your concern?" She advanced into the room, voice rising. "We're your family. Your only family. How can you throw us out on the street?" I looked at her, really looked at the woman my son had chosen. In the harsh light of truth, I could see what I'd been blind to for years. The calculation in her eyes, the entitlement in her posture, the cruelty that had always lurked beneath her charm. "Chelsea," I said quietly, "you forged my signature. You stole my property. You mortgaged my home without my knowledge. You relegated me to the basement of the house I've owned for 40 years, and you planned to sell everything once I was gone. In what world do I owe you anything?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For once, Chelsea Wallace had no words. Lucas finally raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard. "Dad, I know what we did was wrong, but the kids will be fine," I interrupted. "They have 2 parents with college degrees and professional connections. You'll figure it out." "And what about the money?" he asked, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "The loan, the land sale, all of it needs to be accounted for," I said firmly. "Louis is working with the bank on restitution terms." "Restitution?" Chelsea's voice cracked. "You expect us to pay it back? It's gone, Eugene. Spent." "Then I suggest you start selling things," I replied, glancing pointedly at her designer watch, the luxury handbag on the counter, the expensive artwork they'd hung over my fireplace. "Because the alternative is criminal charges, and I don't think either of you would enjoy prison." The truth of their situation seemed to finally hit them both simultaneously. Lucas's shoulders slumped further. Chelsea sank into a chair, the fight draining out of her. Tommy stepped forward, his teenage frame awkward but determined. "Grandpa, can I talk to you alone?" I nodded, following him to the front porch. The night air was cool against my face, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and approaching rain. "I didn't know," he said immediately, turning to face me. "About the land, the forgery, any of it. I swear." "I know you didn't, Tommy," I said gently. "Mum said you wanted us to move in, that you were lonely and needed help." His voice cracked with emotion. "She said you gave them the land money because you didn't need it." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know you believed what they told you." He looked down at his sneakers. "Where will we go?" "Your parents will figure something out," I assured him, "and you can visit me any time. This will always be your grandfather's house." Tommy nodded, then surprised me by wrapping his lanky arms around me in a fierce hug. "I'm sorry," he whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry they did this to you." I held my grandson, feeling the tremors running through his body, and realized that in all this chaos and betrayal, something valuable had been salvaged. The truth had cost me my relationship with my son, but it had given me an authentic connection with my grandson. When we returned inside, Chelsea and Lucas were speaking in hushed, urgent tones that ceased immediately as we entered. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, her small face peaceful despite the upheaval around her. "Tommy, take your sister upstairs," Chelsea commanded, her voice brittle. "Actually," I intervened, "I think it's time everyone went to their rooms. It's been a long night and we all have a lot to process." To my surprise, no one argued. Lucas gathered Lily in his arms, Chelsea collected her phone and wine glass, and they all trudged upstairs, leaving me alone in my living room for the first time in months. I sat in Margaret's old armchair, feeling the familiar contours embrace me. "Well, Maggie," I whispered to the empty room. I finally stood up for myself. "Are you proud?" I could almost hear her answer, her practical, no-nonsense voice telling me she'd been waiting years for me to find my backbone. The thought made me smile despite everything. That night I slept in my own bed for the first time since they'd moved in. I'd simply walked into the master bedroom, removed their things from the nightstands, placed them in the hallway, and locked the door behind me. If there were protests, I didn't hear them through the solid oak door and the earplugs I'd inserted. The next morning brought a strange, strained new reality. Chelsea and Lucas moved through the house like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when necessary. The children were caught in the middle, confused and uncomfortable. I called Louis, updating him on the previous night's events. He sounded relieved. "I filed the injunction against the property transfer," he informed me. "The bank is reviewing the loan documents and has already flagged them as potentially fraudulent. They've suspended any foreclosure proceedings pending investigation." "And criminal charges?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Louis paused. "That's still your call, Jean. The prosecutor is ready to move forward if you give the word." I thought about Lucas, not the man who had betrayed me, but the boy I'd raised. The child who'd cried in my arms when he broke his arm falling from the oak tree in the backyard. The teenager who'd needed my guidance when peer pressure pushed him toward trouble. The young man who'd wept at his mother's funeral, leaning on me for support. Let's hold off, I decided. Give them a chance to make this right. Are you sure? Louis sounded skeptical. After everything they've done? I'm sure, I said, realizing I meant it. I don't want revenge, Louis, I just want my life back. Over the next few days, an uneasy truce settled over the house. Chelsea spent most of her time on the phone, speaking in hushed tones I couldn't quite make out. Lucas disappeared for hours at a time, returning with red eyes and the smell of cheap whiskey clinging to his clothes. I focused on reclaiming my space. I moved my things back up from the basement. I replanted Margaret's herb garden that Chelsea had ripped out for her modern landscaping. I restored the family photos to the mantelpiece, replacing the abstract art Chelsea had installed. It was Tommy who finally broke the impasse, approaching me as I sorted through boxes in the garage. Mom and Dad are thinking about moving to Cincinnati, he said, helping me lift a heavy container. Dad says his college roommate has a rental property there. Cincinnati? That's quite a distance, I observed, watching his face carefully. Tommy nodded, not meeting my eyes. Yeah. Mom says there's nothing left for them here now, too many burned bridges. The implication hung in the air between us. And how do you feel about that? I asked. Gently. He shrugged, the universal teenage gesture of complicated emotions. I don't know. I've got friends here, school, but also, he trailed off. But also what, Tommy? But also everyone knows now about what they did to you. His voice dropped to a whisper. Kids at school are talking. Someone's dad works at the bank. They're calling my parents thieves. My heart ached for him. In protecting myself, I'd exposed my grandchildren to public humiliation. Tommy, I said carefully, what your parents did was wrong, but that doesn't define who you are. You did nothing wrong. Then why does it feel like everything's falling apart? He asked, his voice cracking. I had no good answer for that. 3 weeks later, a moving truck appeared in front of my house once again, this time to take rather than deliver. The Cincinnati plan had materialized with surprising speed, driven by Chelsea's determination to escape the whispers and sideways glances that had become their daily reality in Maplewood. I watched from the porch as they loaded furniture, boxes, and hastily packed belongings. Much of what they'd brought to my house remained behind. Too expensive to move, Lucas had muttered when I asked. I suspected it had more to do with the restitution agreement Louis had drafted, which required them to liquidate assets to begin repaying the fraudulent loans. Chelsea supervised the movers with brittle efficiency, never once glancing in my direction. We hadn't spoken directly in days, communicating through Lucas or the children when absolutely necessary. Her anger had crystallized into cold disdain, as if I were the villain in her story rather than the victim. Lucas approached me as the last boxes were being loaded. He looked thinner, older, the strain of recent weeks etched into new lines around his eyes. I guess this is it, he said, hands shoved deep in his pockets. I nodded, unsure what to say. What were the right words for a moment like this? What wisdom could I impart to a son who had betrayed me so completely? I'm sorry, Dad, he said finally, the words seeming to cost him physical pain. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. Are you sorry you did it, or sorry you got caught? I asked, the question that had haunted me for weeks. He flinched as if I'd struck him. Both, I guess. At first, just sorry we got caught. But now, he looked. Around at the house, the yard, the life he was leaving behind. Now I understand what I've lost, what I threw away. It wasn't just the land or the money, Lucas, I said quietly. It was trust, respect, the values your mother and I tried to teach you. I know. He swallowed hard. Chelsea, don't blame your wife, I interrupted. You made your choices. He nodded, accepting the rebuke. The kids want to know if they can still visit. For holidays, maybe? The question caught me off guard. After everything, he still assumed some kind of relationship would continue. Part of me wanted to refuse, to cut all ties with the son who had tried to steal my life out from under me. But then I thought of Tommy and Lily, innocent participants in their parents' schemes. The children are always welcome, I said finally. As for you and Chelsea, I need time. I understand, he said, though his expression suggested otherwise. We'll be in touch about the restitution payments. I've got some job interviews lined up in Cincinnati. Good luck, I offered, the words feeling hollow but necessary. Chelsea honked the car horn impatiently. Lucas glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. For a moment, I thought he might embrace me, a final gesture of the father-son bond we'd once shared. Instead, He simply nodded, turned, and walked away. I watched the procession leave, moving truck first, followed by Chelsea's SUV with Lily, then Lucas's sedan with Tommy in the passenger seat. My grandson twisted in his seat to look back, raising his hand in a solemn farewell. I returned the gesture, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't name. As the vehicles disappeared around the corner, the silence they left behind felt both desolate and liberating. My house was mine again. My life was my own. The cost had been tremendous, but standing there in the autumn sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Helen Morris appeared at my garden gate that afternoon, casserole in hand. "Thought you might not feel like cooking," she said, bustling past me into the kitchen. "The vultures have flown, I see." Despite everything, I winced at her characterization of my family. "They've moved to Cincinnati." "Good riddance," she sniffed, setting the casserole on the counter. "After what they did to you, Eugene, I'm amazed you didn't have them arrested." "They're still my family," I said simply. Helen's expression softened. "You're a better person than most, Jean Carter. Now sit down and eat while it's hot. You've lost weight, and not in a good way." That evening, after Helen had gone, I wandered through my empty house. It felt larger somehow, echoing with 40 years of memories. Margaret laughing in the kitchen, Lucas learning to walk, his tiny hands gripping my fingers for balance. Tommy and Lily opening Christmas presents by the fireplace. I paused in the doorway of what had been Lily's room, now stripped of her posters and stuffed animals. On the windowsill, she'd left a small ceramic angel, one Margaret had given her on her 5th birthday. Deliberately or accidentally, I couldn't tell. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. In that moment, standing in the empty bedroom with my granddaughter's forgotten treasure, the full weight of what had happened, what I had lost and what I had saved, crashed over me. I sank onto the bare mattress and wept for the first time since Margaret died, not just for the betrayal and the hurt, but for the family that would never be whole again. When the tears finally subsided, I placed the angel on my bedside table, a reminder of what remained despite everything. The next morning I called Louis. "I want to create a trust," I told him, "for Tommy and Lily's education, from the land." "Are you sure, Jean?" he asked carefully. "After everything that's happened." "The land was always meant for them," I said firmly. "Not the way Lucas and Chelsea tried to take it, but as a legacy, a future. I want to do this properly." Louis agreed to draw up the paperwork, and I spent the day walking the boundaries of Uncle Harold's 10 acres. The autumn colors were at their peak, transforming the ordinary farmland into a canvas of gold, crimson, and bronze. Standing in the center of the property, I felt a connection to something larger than myself, a continuity that stretched backward to my ancestors and forward to my grandchildren. "This is how it should be, Maggie," I said aloud, knowing somehow that she could hear me. "This is what matters." The first snow of winter came early that year, blanketing Maplewood in pristine white, just before Thanksgiving. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee mug warming my hands, watching the neighborhood children build snowmen and wage friendly battles with packed snowballs. The simple joy in their laughter made me smile despite the hollow ache that had settled in my chest since Lucas and Chelsea's departure. 2 months had passed. The legal matters were progressing slowly but steadily. Louis had established the educational trust for Tommy and Lily, using the land as collateral rather than selling it outright. The bank had reversed the fraudulent loan against my house, though the process had been complicated and required numerous affidavits and hearings. The phone rang, startling me from my reverie. I recognized the Cincinnati area code immediately. "Hello?" I answered, my heart quickening despite my efforts at detachment. "Grandpa?" Tommy's voice came through deeper than I remembered. "It's me, Tommy," I said warmly. "How are you, son?" "Okay, I guess. School's different here. The math is behind where I was in Maplewood, but they're really into basketball." He paused. "I made the JV team." "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased. Tommy had always loved basketball, but had been too shy to try out at his old school. "Your grandmother would be proud." "Yeah," he said, his voice softening at the mention of Margaret. "Listen, Grandpa, I was wondering, could I come visit? For Thanksgiving, maybe." The question caught me off guard. "What do your parents say about that?" A hesitation. "They said it's up to you. Dad says he understands if you don't want to see any of us." I closed my eyes, picturing my grandson, Lanky, awkward, caught between childhood and adulthood, and now between warring factions of his family. Of course you can visit, Tommy, any time. This is still your grandfather's house. The relief in his voice was palpable. Really? That's awesome. I'll tell them tonight. After we hung up, I stood in my silent kitchen, considering the implications. Having Tommy visit would be wonderful, but it also meant negotiating with Lucas and Chelsea about transportation, timing, rules. It meant reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal, but as I looked around my empty house, I realized that the silence I'd fought so hard to reclaim had become its own kind of prison. The victory of regaining my home felt hollow without family to share it with, even a fractured, complicated family. That evening I did something I hadn't done since before the confrontation. I called Lucas directly. His voice when he answered was cautious, disbelieving. "Dad, is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I assured him. "Tommy called about visiting for Thanksgiving." "Oh," a pause. I told him it was probably too soon, but he insisted on asking. I told him yes, I said simply. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words, questions, regrets. "Thank you," Lucas finally said. That means a lot to him, to all of us. "I'm not doing it for you or Chelsea," I clarified. "I'm doing it for Tommy, and for Lily." "I understand." His voice was subdued. "Dad, I know you don't want to hear this, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry. More sorry than you can possibly know." I stood at my window watching the snow continue to fall, covering the world in clean white. There was something symbolic in it, nature's way of offering a fresh start. "I believe you're sorry, Lucas," I said finally, "but trust is like a mirror. Once it's broken, you can never look at it the same way again." "I know," he said quietly. "We're working with a financial advisor here, setting up a payment plan for the restitution. It's going to take years, but we'll pay back every penny." It was the first concrete step toward amends that I'd heard from him. Not just words, but action. "That's good to hear," I acknowledged. "How's the job search going?" "I found something. Not as good as what I had in Maplewood, but it pays the bills. Chelsea's working too, office manager at a dental practice." The mention of Chelsea stirred my anger again, but I pushed it aside. "And Lily, how is she adjusting?" "She misses you," he said simply. "Sleeps with that ceramic angel every night." My throat tightened. "The one Margaret gave her?" "Yeah. She says it protects her from bad dreams." He cleared his throat. "She'd love to come with Tommy for Thanksgiving, if that's okay." I thought about my empty dining room table, the quiet holidays I'd been preparing myself to endure. Yes, that would be fine. We arranged the details. Lucas would drive them to Maplewood the day before Thanksgiving and pick them up the following Sunday. 4 days with my grandchildren. 4 days to begin rebuilding something from the ashes of what had been destroyed. After hanging up, I felt lighter somehow. Not healed, that would take much longer if it ever happened completely, but as if the first step on that path had been taken. Week before Thanksgiving, I threw myself into preparations. I cleaned the house thoroughly, set up the guest rooms for Tommy and Lily, and planned a traditional meal with all their favorites. Helen Morris offered to help with the cooking, but I declined. This was something I needed to do myself, to reclaim my role as the patriarch of my family, diminished though it might be. When Thanksgiving Day arrived, my house filled with the aromas of roasting turkey, fresh bread and pumpkin pie, Margaret's recipes followed to the letter. Tommy and Lily had arrived the previous evening, bubbling with excitement despite the obvious tension when Lucas dropped them off. My son and I had exchanged awkward greetings in the driveway, neither quite sure how to navigate our new reality, but when Lily had flung herself into my arms, her small body warm and trusting against my chest, something in my heart had softened. Now we sat around my dining room table, just the three of us, with 2 empty chairs that seemed to hold the ghosts of what might have been. I carved the turkey, served the sides, and listened as my grandchildren chatted about their new school, their new house, their new lives. "Dad says we might be able to come back for Christmas too," Lily said hopefully, looking up at me with Margaret's eyes. "Can we, Grandpa?" "We'll see," I said, not wanting to make promises I couldn't keep. One holiday at a time. After dinner, as we settled in the living room with slices of pie, Tommy grew serious. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you ever going to forgive Mom and Dad?" The directness of the question took my breath away. I set my dessert plate down, choosing my words carefully. Forgiveness is complicated, Tommy. It takes time. But they're really sorry, Lily interjected. Daddy cries sometimes when he thinks we're asleep. The image of my son, a grown man with children of his own, crying in the night over his mistakes, hit me harder than I expected. I believe they're sorry, I said gently. And I'm working on forgiveness. But some things can't be undone, they can only be lived with. Tommy nodded, seeming to understand more than a 16-year-old should have to. The kids at my new school don't know what happened, it's easier there. Sometimes a fresh start is what people need, I acknowledged. But we still need you, Lily said, climbing into my lap as she had when she was much younger. You're our grandpa. I held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. I'll always be your grandpa. Nothing will ever change that. That night, after they were asleep, I sat in Margaret's armchair and imagined what she would say about all of this. She had always been the practical one, the one who could forgive without forgetting, who could love without blindness. I needed her wisdom now more than ever. What do I do, Maggie? I whispered to the empty room. How do I balance justice with mercy? How do I protect myself without punishing the children? The answer came not in words but in a feeling, a certainty that the path forward wasn't about erasing the past, but about building something new on its foundation. Not a restoration of what was lost, but a creation of something different, perhaps even stronger for having been broken and remade. The Cincinnati visits became regular over the winter months. Tommy and Lily came for a weekend in January, then for their school's February break. Each time the exchanges with Lucas grew marginally less strained. Chelsea remained distant, never. Leaving the car during drop-offs and pickups, her eyes hidden behind large sunglasses regardless of the weather. By March, Lucas had made the first 3 restitution payments, modest amounts that barely dented the total owed, but significant in their consistency. He never mentioned them during our brief interactions, and I never brought them up. Some things were better acknowledged through action rather than words. Spring came to Maplewood with its usual flourish of green and renewal. I spent more time on Uncle Harold's land, clearing brush, planning a small vegetable garden near the road, sitting in quiet contemplation as red-winged blackbirds called from the fence posts. The educational trust for Tommy and Lily was fully established now, the land's value securing their college futures without being sold. It was during one of these visits to the property that I saw the car, Lucas's sedan, parked at the edge of the access road. He stood leaning against it, watching me from a distance, clearly uncertain whether to approach. I raised a hand in acknowledgement and he straightened, walking slowly across the field toward me. Dad, he greeted me, stopping a respectful distance away. Helen Morris said I might find you here. Just doing some spring cleanup, I explained, gesturing to the garden tools in my wheelbarrow. What brings you to Maplewood? Job interview, he said. Back at Mid-State Insurance. My old position opened up. I raised my eyebrows in surprise. You're thinking of moving back? He nodded, looking out across the land rather than at me. Maybe. If they'll have me. And if, he hesitated, if you think that would be okay. The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Was he asking permission to return to Maplewood, or was he asking if there was any chance of rebuilding what had been broken between us? What about Chelsea? I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. She's staying in Cincinnati with her sister. We're separating. I'm sorry to hear that, I said automatically, though I wasn't entirely sure if I meant it. Don't be, he said with surprising candor. It's been a long time coming, even before everything that happened here. She's not the person I thought I married. I thought about pointing out that he hadn't been the person I thought I'd raised either, but held my tongue. Some truths, even when deserved, served no purpose except to wound. The kids would stay with me during the school year, he continued. Summers with her. They miss Maplewood. They're friends. You. I leaned on my shovel, considering the implications. And the restitution? Still my responsibility, he said firmly. I've got it. Structured into my finances now. The payments will continue no matter what. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the spring air. We both watched its lazy spiral, 2 men connected by blood and history and mistakes, standing on land that had almost come between them. Why did you do it, Lucas? I finally asked the question that had haunted me for months. Was it just the money? He Was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was raw with shame. It was never just about the money. It was proving something. To Chelsea, to myself, that I could provide the life she wanted. He shook his head. It sounds pathetic now, hollow. It was, I agreed, not softening the truth. But understanding why doesn't change what happened. I know that, he said, finally meeting my eyes directly. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Dad. I haven't earned that yet. Maybe I never will. I'm just asking if there's room in this town for both of us to live our separate lives, for the kids to have their grandfather without everything being poisoned by what I did. I studied my son's face, the face I'd watched change from infant to child to man. The face that now showed every line of consequence and regret earned over the past year. He wasn't asking for restoration to his former place in my life. He was asking for the chance to build something new, something honest. I think Maplewood's big enough for both of us, I said finally. And I think Tommy and Lily deserve to have their family, what's left of it, in the same town. The relief on his face was palpable. Thank you. I nodded, then turned back to my work. A clear dismissal, but not an unkind one. Lucas hesitated, then returned to his car. I watched him drive away, dust rising behind his tires on the country road. That evening, I called Lewis Barrett. I need your advice, I told him. Not as my lawyer, but as my friend. Those are often the same thing, Gene, he chuckled. What's on your mind? I explained Lucas's potential return to Maplewood, the separation from Chelsea, my mixed feelings about having him nearby again. What are you really asking me? Louis probed gently. Whether you should let him back into your life. I suppose I am, I admitted. Part of me says I'd be a fool to trust him again. The other part remembers he's your son. Louis finished for me. The only child you and Margaret had together. Yes. Louis was quiet for a moment. You know, Jean, in 40 years of practicing law, I've seen a lot of families torn apart by money, property, inheritance. Most never find their way back to each other. And you think we could? I think you've already started, he said thoughtfully. The regular visits with the grandkids, the restitution payments, his willingness to accept responsibility without excuses. Those aren't small things. But are they enough? I pressed. Only you can answer that, Louis replied. But I'll tell you what Margaret would say. I smiled despite myself. Louis and Margaret had been friends since high school. And what's that? She'd say forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about creating space for a different future. The words resonated with what I'd felt that night after Thanksgiving, sitting in Margaret's chair. Thank you, Louis, I said sincerely. Any time, old friend. Now, are we still on for Chess Thursday? Life continued its forward march. Lucas got the job at Midstate and found a small rental house on the other side of Maplewood. Tommy and Lily enrolled to start the new school year in their old district. Chelsea remained in Cincinnati, making occasional weekend trips to see the children. The first time Lucas brought them to my house after moving back, he didn't drop them off and leave as I'd expected. Instead, he stood awkwardly on the porch, a grocery bag in his hands. I brought ingredients for dinner, he explained hesitantly. Thought maybe I could. Cook for everyone, if that's okay. It was a small gesture, yet significant in its humility. The Lucas who had tried to steal my property would never have offered to cook in my kitchen. That would be nice, I said, stepping aside to let him in. The evening wasn't without its tense moments and awkward silences, but watching Lucas interact with his children, patient, attentive, without the distraction of Chelsea's demands, I glimpsed the father he was capable of being, the man he might yet become. As spring turned to summer, our cautious détente evolved into something resembling a normal family relationship. Not what we'd had before, that was gone forever, but something new built on clearer boundaries and painfully earned honesty. On a warm evening in June, I invited Lucas to join me. On Uncle Harold's land, we walked the property in companionable silence, watching the fireflies begin to emerge as dusk settled over the fields. I've been thinking, I said finally, stopping at the spot where I'd planted my small garden. This land should have a purpose. It's too good to just sit empty. Lucas nodded, careful not to presume anything about my intentions. What kind of purpose? Community gardens, maybe. A place where families without yards could grow their own food, or a nature preserve for the school to use for field trips. I turned to face him directly. I'd like your help figuring it out. The surprise on his face was evident. My help? Why? Because despite everything, you're still my son. And someday, long after I'm gone, this land will belong to Tommy and Lily. Through the trust, I want you to understand its value beyond dollars and cents. I want you to help them understand it too. Lucas swallowed hard, emotion making his voice rough. I'd be honored to help, Dad. As we walked back to our respective cars in the gathering twilight, Lucas paused. You know, when we were kids, Mom used to say something when I'd mess up really badly. What's that? I asked, curious about this memory of Margaret I hadn't heard before. She'd say, the measure of a person isn't in never falling down, it's in how they choose to get back up. He smiled faintly. I think I'm finally understanding what she meant. I nodded, feeling Margaret's presence between us, her wisdom bridging the gap that remained. She was right about most things, your mother. Yeah, he agreed. She was. Later that night, I sat on my back porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the summer sky. The house behind me was quiet now, but it no longer felt empty. It was filled with possibility, with the promise of grandchildren's visits, of cautious family dinners, of slow healing across generations. The land that had almost torn us apart was now becoming a foundation for something new, not just physically, but in what it represented. A legacy not of money or property, but of values, of second chances earned through genuine change, of the quiet dignity that comes from choosing reconciliation over resentment. I thought about the long road we'd traveled, the betrayal, the confrontation, the painful separation, and now the tentative rebuilding. It hadn't been easy. It still wasn't. But sitting there under the vast canopy of stars, I felt a peace I hadn't known since before Margaret's passing. The measure of a person isn't in never falling down, I whispered to the night. It's in how they choose to get back up. And in that moment I knew we were all, in our imperfect human way, finally choosing to get back up.